Imagine walking into your friend's home just before midnight. It's quiet. The lights are dim. You call out his name, expecting him to emerge from another room with that familiar smile. But instead, you find him lying still in the hallway. And in that single breathless moment, everything you thought was certain about life, fame, and the people we idolize shatters like glass. That's exactly what happened to those close to Jonathan Brandis on the night of November 11th, 2003, a night that still echoes with uncomfortable questions. This is not just another story about a Hollywood tragedy. This is a story about the quiet collapse behind the loud applause, the loneliness behind the autograph lines, and the deafening silence we keep when someone smiles in public but screams in private. So, before we dive deep into the twists and turns of Jonathan Brandis' life, the child star, turned teen idol, turned heartbreak headline, let me ask you this. What if we, as a society, are complicit in the very tragedies we mourn? What if the same hands that applaud too loudly in success are the same ones that remain folded when help is needed most? Welcome back to the channel, where we peel back the layers of stories that deserve more than just sympathy, that demand introspection. If you're someone who values truth over facade and context over headlines, hit that subscribe button now and be part of a community that refuses to let the deeper story go untold. Let's get into it. Jonathan Brandis was not supposed to die at 27. He was supposed to grow into the kind of actor who would one day walk onto an awards stage, thank his early career, and speak about the road from teen fame to artistic integrity. Instead, his story ended abruptly and painfully, in the middle of a journey that never got the chance to evolve. To many who came of age in the early 90s, Jonathan wasn't just an actor, he was a presence. His face covered the walls of teenage bedrooms. His characters offered refuge to those who felt unseen. And for a brief moment, it seemed like Hollywood had found a rare thing, a child actor who could survive the transition to adulthood. But as we'll discover, survival in that world often depends on more than just talent. It depends on timing, luck, support, and sometimes the things no one talks about until it's too late. From his start as a toddler in commercials to becoming a household name in SeaQuest DSV, Jonathan's rise was nothing short of meteoric. He wasn't just booked and busy. He was beloved. But behind the magazine covers and fan mail was a young man gradually being hollowed out by the very machine that built him up. And it all started, ironically, because he did everything right. As a culture, we love our prodigies. We celebrate children who perform beyond their years, who carry scripts with poise, who smile charmingly on cue. But what happens when that child stops being marketable? What happens when his value is measured in screen time and ratings, not in health or stability? The entertainment industry, for all its lights and promises, has always had a blind spot when it comes to emotional care, especially for young talent. Jonathan wasn't some anonymous face in a sea of former child stars. He wasn't forgotten until the end. Quite the opposite. He was still working, still auditioning, still trying. And youth was unraveling. Quietly, tragically, invisibly. This first section isn't about judgment. It's about the question we all need to start asking. How did we not see it coming? What's more disturbing is how familiar this story is starting to sound. Look around. Social media is our new stage. Teenagers today don't need to be cast in a TV show to feel the crushing pressure of being liked, being seen, being perfect. They're performing daily for an invisible audience that can love them today and forget them tomorrow. The spotlight has moved from Hollywood sets to the palm of every hand holding a smartphone. And the consequences? Still fatal. That's why Jonathan Brandis' story matters now more than ever. Because it forces us to confront our own role not just as viewers, but as participants in a culture that lifts people too high to hear them cry. Over the next few chapters, We're going to walk through the timeline of Brandis' life. We'll examine the relationships, the turning points, the promises made and broken. And in doing so, we'll try to answer the question, what was really lost that night in Los Angeles? So stay with me, because this isn't just about Jonathan Brandis. It's about all the voices we silence with applause, and all the tragedies we write off as just another Hollywood ending. If the end of Jonathan Brandis' story leaves us shaken, then the beginning feels almost scripted by destiny. A beautiful boy with expressive eyes, the kind that casting agents call camera ready. He seemed born for the screen, and that's exactly what his parents believed. At just 2 years old, Jonathan was already appearing in print ads. By 4, he was delivering lines for TV commercials with the kind of composure many adult actors still struggle to find. But this wasn't just a sweet family scrapbook moment. It was a calculated launch. When most toddlers are learning to tie their shoes, Jonathan was learning to hold a product and smile on cue. It wasn't long before the Brandis family traded their East Coast life for Los Angeles, a move driven not by whim, but by ambition. And it worked. Jonathan quickly landed the role of Kevin Buchanan in One Life to Live at the age of 6. An early foothold in the notoriously unforgiving entertainment industry. From there, everything escalated. He became a guest star on popular family shows like Full House and The Wonder Years, each role cementing his place in the hearts of American households. By the late 80s, Brandis was no longer just a promising child actor, he was a known name. But here's the part no one likes to talk about. That kind of visibility at that age is intoxicating and isolating. You grow up not knowing who you are, only who the world tells you to be. Then came the NeverEnding Story II film that, despite underwhelming at the box office, gave Jonathan his breakout moment as a lead actor. Over 600 children auditioned for the part of Bastian Balthazar Bucks. Brandis won it. For Hollywood, that meant one thing: marketable potential. For Jonathan, it meant something far more precarious, a transition point between innocent child roles and the confusing world of adolescent fame. It wasn't a clean leap. Casting directors scrutinized him constantly, not for his acting, but for his height, his voice, his ability to age well on camera. Think about that for a moment. While most kids worried about braces or school dances, Jonathan was being measured against his peers for teen magazine appeal. He was 13 years old and already trying to shed the child actor label, not for himself, but to remain relevant in an industry that discards youth the moment it stops being cute. And then came SeaQuest DSV, the show that would both crown him and curse him. Landing the role of Lucas Wolenzak, an underwater teen prodigy in a sci-fi world backed by none other than Steven Spielberg, should have been the pinnacle. And in many ways, it was. Jonathan was 17. He had grown taller, more confident on screen, and teen girls across the country were practically throwing themselves at production gates just to catch a glimpse. He wasn't just famous. He was a heartthrob. But popularity is a double-edged sword. Behind the camera, SeaQuest was a mess of executive shakeups, creative overhauls, and backstage tension. Producers were fighting. Cast members left. Storylines shifted mid-season. And Jonathan, this boy who had never known life outside of scripts and sets, was stuck in the eye of the storm. Despite all this, he kept showing up, kept performing, kept trying. Why? Because what else did he know? He wasn't just acting on television. He was surviving in a system that used him as currency. In the second season, his rising stardom led NBC to restructure the entire show around a younger cast, hoping to hook the teenage demographic even tighter. And while that move protected Jonathan's place in the show, it also placed an unbearable amount of pressure on his shoulders. He was no longer just a cast member. He was the brand. And still, he rose to the challenge. He even wrote an episode in Season 2, an unusual privilege for someone his age, but a clear indicator of his creative talent. The show, however, kept unraveling. By Season 3, many original cast members had left or been pushed out. Ratings dropped. NBC panicked. The series was canceled abruptly mid-season. To the public, it might have looked like just another show getting the axe. But to Jonathan, it was the foundation cracking beneath his feet. SeaQuest had been his identity. Without it, what was left? Hollywood's memory is short. One moment you're on every magazine cover. The next you're a trivia question. After SeaQuest, Jonathan found some work television movies. Small roles in bigger films, but the momentum had shifted. You could see it in his interviews. That brightness in his eyes had dimmed just slightly. He spoke often about not wanting to be seen as just a teen magazine kid, about wanting to be taken seriously as an actor. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be respected. And isn't that the cruel irony? For so long, he was loved for his appearance, his charm, his accessibility. But once he outgrew those things, once he sought something deeper, the industry turned indifferent. Still, he kept going, because giving up would mean accepting that everything he had sacrificed was for nothing. He was young, ambitious, and despite the disappointment, still hopeful. But hope is fragile when it isn't shared. And as we'll see in the next part of this journey, even the strongest performer can only carry the weight of loneliness for so long. When a person begins to fall, the presence or absence of those around them can mean the difference between a stumble and a tragedy. In Jonathan Brandis' case, he wasn't entirely alone. He had colleagues, friends, family, and a girlfriend. But as we peel back the layers, we start to see that even a crowd can feel like a desert when no one's truly listening. Let's begin with his parents. From the very start, they were the architects of his career. They saw a spark in their son and took the bold step of relocating to Los Angeles, the heart of the entertainment industry, to give him a shot. There's no denying they believed in him. But belief is a complex thing when it overlaps with business. Jonathan was the product, the investment, the rising star they helped build. That kind of dynamic, especially between parent and child, can blur the lines between love and performance. How much of their support was personal, and how much was professional? We may never know, but we can ask, when the spotlight dimmed, were they still watching closely? Then came the friends, particularly Soleil Moon Frye, best known as Punky Brewster, a fellow child star who ran in the same Hollywood circles. She would later reflect publicly on her guilt after Jonathan's death. In interviews, she confessed that she didn't reach out when she should have, didn't ask the harder questions when he seemed off. It's a painful admission, and perhaps one many can relate to. We often assume someone is okay if they're not crying out. But what if their silence is the cry? Jonathan's most high-profile relationship was with Tatiana Ali, who had her own rise to fame on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. They met in their teens at a Halloween party. He was 17. She was 14. It took 2 years for that spark to turn into a relationship, one that lasted around 6 years. That's practically a lifetime in young Hollywood. But as Tatiana would later admit, there were complications. The fame imbalance was obvious. He was older, already seasoned in the industry, and carried a kind of quiet intensity. She described feeling unsure at times, intimidated even, not just by him, but by everything he represented. And when they finally broke up in 2001, after years of being each other's anchor in an unstable industry, it left Jonathan more isolated than ever. There were no scandals, no drama, no public meltdowns, just a clean break followed by an emotional void. We can't underestimate the impact of that kind of loss on someone whose identity was already tied so closely to the approval of others. Another figure in Jonathan's circle was Roy Scheider, his co-star on SeaQuest DSV. Scheider was a seasoned actor, most famous for Jaws, and took on something of a mentor role during their time on set. He once said that Jonathan handled fame with a grain of salt, suggesting a maturity beyond his years. But even that observation came with an addendum, except when it came to girls. Scheider said it jokingly, but it speaks volumes. Jonathan was navigating relationships, adolescence, and a volatile industry all at once, and doing it largely alone. And then there was Enby, not a person, but a towering presence in his life. The network that gave him his biggest break also dealt the most crushing blow. After 3 tumultuous seasons of SeaQuest, they canceled the show without warning, pulling the rug out from under their young star. Jonathan had remained loyal, professional, and hopeful. In return, he got a brutal reminder that in Hollywood, loyalty is a one-way street. It's worth pausing here to ask, how many people around him truly saw Jonathan? Not just the actor, not just the heartthrob, but the person, the sensitive, introspective young man who had been working since he was 4 years old, who had barely known a life outside of performance. This is where the tragedy deepens, because there were moments, many of them, when Jonathan tried to reach out. According to reports from close friends, he began drinking heavily toward the end. He would talk about feeling lost, unheard, unsure of his future. Those are not subtle warning signs. Those are flares. And yet, the machine kept moving. Hollywood doesn't stop to check on the wounded. It just recasts them. Even Jaleel White, another actor known for his role as Steve Urkel in Family Matters, shared a deeply telling moment. He worked with Jonathan on the failed pilot 111, Gramercy Park, and remembered how anxious Brandis was about whether the show would get picked up. He said Jonathan asked about it repeatedly, far more than any actor he'd ever worked with. That kind of fixation doesn't come from ambition alone. It comes from desperation, from needing one last foothold before the slide becomes irreversible. There's something chilling about that, because it wasn't a lack of talent. Jonathan was good. Harvey Keitel, a legend in his own right, worked with him on Puerto Vallarta's Squeeze and openly praised him, saying, "This kid is good." The film's producer echoed the sentiment. Everyone around him saw potential, but no one, it seems, saw the pain. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing patterns, about understanding that support doesn't always look like applause, and concern doesn't always sound like praise. Sometimes it's the quiet moments, the unspoken hesitations, the subtle shifts in someone's tone that tell the real story. But you have to be close enough and willing and auto-notice. In the case of Jonathan Brandis, we have to ask, how many people were close enough? And of those who were, how many were paying attention? We often comfort ourselves with the idea that tragedies make sense in hindsight, that if we had just paid a bit more attention, read one more signal, asked one more question, the outcome might have changed. But when we look at Jonathan Brandis' final years, we're not just dealing with missed signs. We're confronting a system that conditions people, especially young stars, to ignore pain until it's too late. Let's revisit one of the most chilling inconsistencies in this entire narrative. Jonathan was still working, even as he spiraled emotionally, even as his career momentum slowed. He was showing up on sets, learning lines, pushing forward. In 2002, he landed a supporting role in Heart's War, a major film starring Bruce Willis and Colin Farrell. For most actors clawing their way out of the teen idol pigeonhole, this would have been a lifeline, a chance to pivot, to be taken seriously. And yet, the film's final edit cut almost all of his scenes. A performance he likely hoped would redefine him was reduced to a deleted clip. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. Imagine that. You put in the work, You deliver. And when the curtain rises, you're invisible. It's not just professional rejection. It's existential erasure. If you're already doubting your worth, this is the kind of blow that confirms your worst fears. Then came 111 Gramercy Park, a promising pilot that paired Jonathan with well-known names like Jaleel White and even Hollywood legend Tippi Hedren. The show had buzz. And Brandis, ever the professional, did what he always had, committed fully. But behind the scenes, something had changed. He wasn't just eager, he was anxious. Obsessively so. Jaleel White recalled how Jonathan would repeatedly ask about whether the show would get picked up. How he seemed unable to let go of the question. That wasn't just nerves. That was someone desperately clinging to the edge. And when Gramercy Park was passed over by the network, the emotional fallout was enormous. In the public eye, it was just another pilot that didn't make the cut. For Jonathan, it may have felt like the final confirmation that he no longer had a place in the world he grew up in. Let's stop here for a moment and ask, why was no one talking about his mental health? This was a young man who had spent over 2 decades in front of cameras, who had navigated the cutthroat nature of Hollywood from preschool to adulthood, who had experienced the full range of fame from idol worship to industry indifference, and yet, in all the interviews, all the retrospectives, mental health was barely mentioned until after his death. Why? Part of the answer lies in the culture of the time. Early 2000s America was still deeply uncomfortable with discussing depression, especially among men. Especially among successful men. Especially among famous successful men. There was a kind of toxic silence that implied, if you've got money, fans, and a career, you have no right to feel broken. That's why what Jonathan's father later said matters so much. In a 2021 interview, nearly 2 decades after his son's passing, Greg Brandis opened up about something the industry had ignored. Jonathan, he believed, had undiagnosed bipolar disorder. Looking back, he saw the mood swings, the intense highs followed by crushing lows, the bursts of energy, the paralyzing doubt. It was all there, but untreated, undiscussed, unrecognized. And that raises one of the most uncomfortable truths of all. We don't just fail our celebrities. We fail anyone who doesn't look like they should be struggling. Jonathan didn't match the image of someone in crisis. He was polite, composed, hardworking. He showed up, and so we assumed he was fine. But even the most composed exterior can mask unbearable pain. According to friends, his drinking had increased in his final year. His conversations grew darker. He talked about losing hope. He wasn't hiding it. He was whispering it. The problem was, no one leaned in to hear. There's also something to be said about the cruel rhythm of Hollywood, a feast or famine cycle that consumes young actors. One moment you're flooded with scripts, offers, premieres. The next, your phone goes quiet. Your agent grows distant. And suddenly, it's as if you never existed. That kind of whiplash is hard enough for seasoned adults. For someone who'd been working since age 4, it's devastating. Then came Puerto Vallarta Squeeze, a film that should have been his comeback. He had a substantial role opposite Harvey Keitel, who praised his talent openly. The crew was impressed. The mood was optimistic. For a moment, it seemed like maybe the tide was turning. But optimism can be a fragile thing when history has taught you to expect disappointment. And here's what haunts many who knew him. There was no definitive final straw. No huge tabloid scandal. No public meltdown. Just a slow, painful erosion, opportunity shrinking, confidence fraying, hope dimming. And when November 11th, 2003 came, and his friends found him barely clinging to life in his apartment hallway, they were shocked. But should they have been? Maybe the bigger question is, how many of us still would be? Jonathan's story is not one of a dramatic fall from grace. It's the story of someone who did everything right by Hollywood standards, worked hard, stayed out of trouble, kept showing you pan still. It wasn't enough, because in an industry built on perception, reality often goes unnoticed. And in the end, perception didn't save him. In the days that followed Jonathan Brandis' death, the public mourning began late, sudden, and as always, selective. The news hit entertainment outlets with predictable phrases: shocking, unexpected, tragic end for a former teen star. People magazine, News, and online forums buzzed with disbelief. Fans posted pictures, shared favorite scenes from SeaQuest, and typed out digital condolences like prayers into the void. But for all the noise, one question sat quietly beneath it all. Where were these voices when he was still alive? Public grief is a strange phenomenon. It arrives in waves, often long after private suffering has done its damage. In Jonathan's case, it was amplified by the sense of lost potential. He wasn't someone whose career had faded due to scandal or misconduct. He was remembered, even beloved, by those who'd grown up watching him. So when his death was announced, it felt like a cruel interruption to a story that many had assumed would eventually turn hopeful again. But just as quickly as the headlines appeared, they disappeared. And that says something. Because when it comes to Hollywood tragedies, we have a pattern. We grieve the persona, not the person. We say rest in peace to the character, the smile, the nostalgia, but rarely do we interrogate the system that made peace impossible in the first place. Look at the online discourse that erupted in 2003. Some blamed the industry. Others pointed to mental health, alcohol, career setbacks. But very few wanted to talk about the intersection of all those things and the culture of silence that kept them from being addressed until it was too late. Even within fan communities, the conversations often fell into cliches. He seemed so happy. He had everything going for him. I just can't believe it. But that disbelief, in many ways, is part of the problem. It shows how little we allow for complexity in the lives of public figures. We still cling to the idea that if someone looks okay, they're okay. And when their story ends in heartbreak, we act surprised. Jonathan's passing didn't spark the kind of industry reckoning you might expect. There were no sweeping statements from studios, no policy changes about child actor support, no major conversations about the psychological toll of early fame. Instead, the story filed away as a cautionary tale. Perhaps, but not a call to action. That's what makes the 2021 documentary Kid 90, directed by his friend Soleil Moon Frye, so important. It wasn't just a nostalgic look at 90s youth culture. It was a raw and honest attempt to revisit the footage and voices of a generation that lived in the public eye while carrying private burdens. Jonathan appears often in the documentary laughing, reflective, vulnerable, and suddenly, the myth of the perfect teen star shatters. Moon Frye later admitted she felt guilt, that she wished she had picked up on the signs, that she had actually heard what he was trying to say. It's a painful confession, but also a common one, because the truth is, we rarely ask the people around us how they're doing. We ask what they're working on. We ask what's next, especially in Hollywood. Value is measured in momentum, not well-being. Jonathan's ex, Tatiana Ali, also responded after his death, though in a different tone. Initially, she felt anger. Not uncommon when someone dies by suicide. It's a natural, if uncomfortable, emotional response. She had spent 6 years with him, formative years, in a deeply complex relationship that mixed young love with the overwhelming weight of fame. Her anger was real, but it also gave way, eventually, to sadness, regret, and silence. Then there were his fans, many of them now adults, reflecting back on their own teenage years spent watching him on screen. They flooded message boards, old fan sites, and later social media, posting tributes. Some admitted they had crushes. Others said he had been a comfort figure in their awkward adolescence. A few even confessed that they, too, had once felt like they were drowning in silence, that they saw themselves in him, not the star, but the boy behind the smile. There's a term often used in psychological circles: disenfranchised grief. It refers to mourning that isn't recognized by society. Grieving a celebrity often falls into this category. You're expected to get over it quickly because you didn't really know them. But in cases like Jonathan's, that grief becomes something else. It's a mirror. His story forces people to confront the fragility of those they do know. The friends who pull away, the sibling who goes quiet, the coworker who seems fine until they aren't. Yet, the industry didn't want that mirror. Hollywood has a remarkable ability to commodify pain while refusing to confront it. When a young star dies, there's a brief flicker of reflection. Maybe a tribute video, maybe a throwback article. But then the machine moves on. And because Jonathan wasn't part of a massive franchise or a social media star in the modern age, his legacy got absorbed by time, familiar only to those who really watched. And yet, his story lingers, quietly, not in blockbusters, but in the eyes of those who remember what it felt like to grow up with him on their TV screens. In every young actor struggling to transition from child roles to adult life. In every person who works their whole life for validation, only to find emptiness at the peak. The real tragedy of Jonathan Brandis isn't just that he died young. It's that his death didn't cause more people to pause, to rethink how we measure success, how we define resilience, how we respond to suffering that doesn't scream out loud. So here we are nearly 2 decades later, still searching for meaning in the spaces he left behind. Still asking questions that came too late. Still wondering how someone so visible could feel so unseen. Grief, when it finally settles, doesn't bring answers. It brings echo-soft reminders of what was, and what could have been. In Jonathan Brandis' case, those echoes have never truly faded. They hum beneath every reflection about fame, every analysis of child stardom, every conversation about mental health in the public eye. And while time has dulled the shock, it hasn't silenced the questions. Jonathan died in 2003. 2 years later, one of his final films, Bad Girls from Valley High, was quietly released direct to video. No premiere, no red carpet, no interviews. The performance he gave, once seen as a stepping stone back into the mainstream, was barely noticed. For many, it was as though he had already disappeared before the credits rolled. A ghost performance in a film that arrived too late, for an audience that had already moved on. But what if that's exactly the problem? We live in a culture that only notices pain when it becomes unignorable. And even then, we often categorize it as an anomaly, a tragic exception. We shake our heads, we sigh, and we say, "Such a shame." And then we continue building the same structures that made that shame inevitable. Jonathan's father, Greg Brandis, has spoken sparingly in the years since. When he did, it wasn't with anger, it wasn't with blame, it was with clarity. He said he believed his son had been struggling with undiagnosed bipolar disorder, something that, if addressed, might have changed everything. Not just Jonathan's career trajectory, but his entire life. The admission was quiet, but profound, because it pulled the focus away from the industry for a moment and towards something even more deeply rooted: how we treat mental health in people who seem okay. It's easy to say Hollywood is toxic, and it often is. The pressure, the image obsession, the commodification of youth. But toxicity doesn't live in studios alone. It lives in silence, in shame, in the cultural belief that asking for help is a kind of weakness, especially for young men, especially for successful ones, especially for those we think should be immune to suffering. What makes Jonathan's story so haunting isn't just how it ended. It's how many moments along the way could have been different. If someone had noticed, if someone had asked the harder question, if he had been given the same care and attention that his career once demanded. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about acknowledging a system built for appearances, not sustainability. A system that teaches people to smile through fear, to rehearse stability, to measure worth in applause and opportunities instead of inner peace. And here's the part that cuts the deepest. Jonathan was good, not just as an actor, but as a person. His colleagues describe him as thoughtful, intelligent, humble. He wasn't swallowed by scandal. He wasn't undone by arrogance. He did everything he was supposed to do, worked hard, stayed grounded, tried to reinvent himself when the world stopped seeing him the way it used to. But sometimes, trying isn't enough. Not when the framework around you is indifferent. Not when success is measured by visibility alone. Not when even your best work can be deleted in post-production. And your worst days are hidden in plain sight. So where does that leave us? In the years since his passing, the world has changed in many ways. We talk more openly about depression, about burnout, about the cost of curated lives. Social media has exposed just how fragile fame can be, how one moment you're trending, and the next you're forgotten. The cycle is faster now, but it's no less brutal. And still, the questions Jonathan's life poses remain. How do we treat those we admire once they stop entertaining us? Do we value people only when they're producing something for our consumption? Or do we see the human being underneath the role? The Instagram post. The legacy? There's no easy answer. But perhaps the most radical thing we can do, the most meaningful way to honor Jonathan's memory is not just to remember his films, or quote his lines, or repost his photos. It's to listen better. To pause when someone says, "I'm fine," and ask what that really means. To dismantle the idea that achievement equals fulfillment. And to make space for pain, for uncertainty, for the kind of honest conversations that save lives long before they're lost. Because Jonathan Brandis was never just a teen tragedy. He was a talented, thoughtful, complex human being navigating a world that never really taught him how to be one. And in telling his story, not just the highlights, but the hidden chapters, where he reminded that behind every smile in the spotlight is a person hoping someone will see them when the lights go out. So maybe the Real story isn't about a young actor who lost his way. Maybe it's about the world that was never willing to walk beside him. Maybe it's about the questions we never ask of our stars, of our loved ones, of ourselves, until the silence becomes too loud to ignore. Jonathan Brandis didn't leave behind a scandal. He left behind a question, one that still echoes today. How many people do we pass by every day who seem to have it all, but are quietly losing everything that matters? We like to think tragedy makes sense, that if someone was suffering, we would have known, that someone else would have said something. That surely, in a world so connected, no one could truly feel invisible. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes they do. And maybe, just maybe, that truth should change the way we see each other. Not through filters or headlines or performances, but through the fragile, human moments that often go unnoticed. If this story stirred something in you, let it sit. Don't rush to resolve it. Don't file it away as just another sad tale of Hollywood. Let it become a lens. Let it challenge how you show up for others and for yourself. Thank you for staying with us through this difficult but necessary reflection. And don't forget, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a truth that others are too afraid to tell. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones hidden in plain sight. We'll see you next time.